so much. I'm sorry for the delay. So the IRB experience as a data collector in this national evaluation for communities try to improve their system of care for children with serious emotional problem and their families. So this map shows where a number of the projects were located, and I was fortunate to go to Northern California to a project supported by the United Indian Health Service, to Arizona to the Pascoyaki Reservation, and then a number of visits in South Dakota to Pine Ridge Reservation and the Rosebud Reservation. And one of the things that became clear as I was involved as a data collector was a recognition that university IRBs really have not been sufficient in protecting research participants from American Indian and Alaska Native nations. And especially with the emphasis at this conference on community-based research, community-engaged research, I think it's important, as Dr. Rosenfeld noted, that we also consider whether our responsibility to show respect for people's rights and dignity extends beyond individuals and to communities as well. So a couple examples here of studies that either were stigmatizing or involved unanticipated use of data that were collected. And the references for those are in your reference section if these are some that you're not familiar with. And in addition to examples where the dissemination of research results were stigmatizing or offensive to community members, there's another criticism that's often heard from Native American populations that they participate in research but never see applications of the research that benefit their community. So I attended a session at American Psychological Association conference this last summer that's noted in the references, where there were Native American researchers who talked about principles involved in community engaged and participatory research with Native American communities. And I thought that these guidelines were probably exemplars of how we might do community-based research in any community, that a lot of the principles would be applicable. So I thought I'd share some of the resources that I found in case you are working with Native American communities or in case you're working with other communities where these guidances might be relevant. So one resource that's listed in your reference section involved a project that was conducted by Native American communities called Circles of Care. This was a precursor to the federally funded project that I just mentioned. And the researchers and Native American leaders did a comparison of basic principles for community-based participatory research, and that was the Israel et al. Listing of principles, and then compared those to their experience as Native American researchers, and identified a lot of issues where these basic principles overlap with the observation based on research in the Native American communities. And so you can see here a list of the principles that were in common. But then the Native American leaders also identified some additional things that were unique in the Circles of Care project. And one that I thought was really important was their notice that even within a community, within a tradition of a particular ethnicity or tribe, that there are diversities in the traditions within the group, and certainly in comparison to other Native American groups. When I was going to the Rosebud Reservation, the project director called me before I came and said, "What exactly qualifies you to come to our reservation and collect data on our participants?" I'd never been challenged like that before in going to a site visit. And I said, well, I have just participated in this role in the United Indian Health Service in Northern California. She said, no, those Indians aren't anything like us. So we're reminded of the diversity across tribes and even within tribes in the degree of identification with one's tribal or cultural heritage and differences whether the groups are rural or urban. The circles of care also emphasize that spirituality may be especially important within a Native culture. And I thought it was interesting that they were especially outcomes oriented. So here's a set of guiding principles for engaging in research with Native American communities. This publication, I put the reference in the reference section, and it's available for free online. So this is something that you can look up and print. Dr. Rosenfeld mentioned some of the principles that are relevant here. I won't repeat those, but I will just mention one that I thought is a little different take. He talked about the importance of cultural competence, and I think increasingly we're aware that we can't necessarily be competent in dealing with all cultures, and sometimes what we need to do is just to be reflective about our competence and our willingness to learn when we lack competence. And the concept of cultural humility is one that I'm hearing increasingly mentioned, and I think is really important, where we are open to learning and asking and being taught by the people in the community with whom we're working. I'll also just point out the importance of honoring community timeframes. One thing that I learned in working with Native American projects was that the time frame is often very different from an academic timeline. So if you think you're going to get something done within a semester, don't count on it. If it's going to go to the tribal council for consideration of the elders, for consideration of community leaders, for consideration of leaders of the tribe, you need to be sensitive to their timeline. Also, the importance of building on strengths. In this booklet, the Guiding Principles for Engaging in Research with Native American Communities, each of these principles is articulated, and then a vignette is offered that gives an example of application or misapplication of that principle. And the vignette with building on strengths, the example is given of a researcher who went to a Native American community and had data on the high rates of diabetes, the high rates of suicide, the incidence of substance misuse, and he wanted input from the community members about why these problems were so intractable on their reservation. At the end of the session, the people were very demoralized and kind of hopeless. And the researcher would have had a much better interaction with the group if he had not just focused on the problems within the group, but if he had identified some of the very real strengths within the community. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The importance of continual dialogue, and Dr. Rosenfeld mentioned enough communication so you know if your understanding or your vocabulary is consistent with the people with whom you're working. One thing in children's mental health that we learned, standard lists of problems that young children have that can be symptoms of mental health problems. One of the things that was on a standard survey was harms animals. In one of the Native American sites, the participants were horrified by that item. They said, you can't have that on your list. That's awful. And we said, well, you know, sometimes that's a symptom of a mental health concern. And they said, no, not in our culture. Animals are sacred. Children don't harm animals. And they said, you wouldn't put on your survey, doesn't murder parents with an axe. just because it's something that's distressing and can happen, it's not useful in our culture as a symptom. So of course it was removed. But that would be an example of something where insider knowledge of the culture with your measures is especially important. And then also community relevance. That's the last example that I'll give. One of the vignettes talked about a researcher who came into a community with a plan for an intervention that would reduce HIV exposure. Well, that wasn't a priority of the elders in the community. They were much more concerned about teen pregnancy and substance abuse problems. And especially they were concerned about the low number of young people in the community who were learning the native language. So the researcher withdrew, engaged in more communication with the group, came back with a renewed plan for addressing sexual risk-taking more broadly and substance abuse issues, building on cultural identity as one of the interventions for addressing these problems. And one of the components of the cultural identity intervention was learning native language. This was much more acceptable to the community, and the researcher was able to gain admittance. I'll just mention another set of guidelines, which are very good exemplar of working with a Native American population. The Navajo Nation offers a set of standards for research approval. They require a 12-phase review and approval process. And again, the link for that is in your reference list. So finally, I'll just say that questions raised by these two examples of guiding principles for engaging in research with Native American communities, I think can be a model for any community engaged research. And I think it's helpful that they remind us of our responsibilities to sometimes look at our own institutional policies or behaviors or norms of data collection, and keep in mind the history of disrespect or abuse that the communities have experienced, that we need to consider how the research will actually help the communities or address their priorities, and then the importance of following up on the completed research by making culturally relevant recommendations or socially responsive actions at a more systemic level. So I hope these references will be helpful to you. Thanks.